The Forbidden History of Judas, Why the Vatican Tried to Bury the Truth. For nearly 2,000 years, one name has carried the weight of ultimate betrayal. Judas Iscariot, the disciple who sold his master for 30 pieces of silver. The man whose kiss sealed the fate of Jesus Christ. His story has been told countless times, painted on chapel ceilings, carved into cathedral stones, and burned into the consciousness of billions everything. But what if we've been told about Judas is wrong? What if the greatest betrayal in human history was actually an act of profound obedience? What if the Vatican has spent centuries suppressing a truth so dangerous that it could shake the very foundations of Christianity? Deep in the Egyptian desert, buried beneath centuries of sand and silence, lay a secret that the early church tried desperately to erase. A gospel written not about Judas, but supposedly by Judas himself. And when this forbidden text finally surfaced in the modern world, it revealed a story so shocking that it forced us to question everything we thought we knew about faith, betrayal, and the origins of Christianity itself. This isn't just another conspiracy theory or wild speculation. This is documented history, authenticated by some of the world's leading scholars, and verified through carbon dating and linguistic analysis. The Gospel of Judas exists. It's real. And its contents are more explosive than anything Hollywood could imagine. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. The Vatican didn't just ignore this text or dismiss it as fiction. They actively fought against it, condemned it as heresy, and worked systematically to ensure it would never see the light of day. The question we need to ask isn't whether this gospel is authentic. The question is, why were they so afraid of it? What truth could be so dangerous that an institution with nearly 2 billion followers would go to such lengths to bury it? Today, we're going to uncover that truth. We're going to explore how a small leather-bound manuscript survived Roman persecution, systematic destruction, and 17 centuries of burial to challenge everything the Christian world believes about its most notorious villain. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how radical this discovery really is. Imagine if archaeologists uncovered evidence that Benedict Arnold was actually a secret patriot working directly under George Washington's orders. Imagine if documents surfaced proving that Lee Harvey Oswald was acting on behalf of the Kennedy administration. The shock, the confusion, the complete reversal of everything we thought we knew. That's exactly what the Gospel of Judas represents for Christianity, except magnified by 2,000 years of accepted history. To understand why this text is so threatening, we need to step back and examine the world it emerged from. The 2nd century of the Common Era was a time of incredible religious diversity. Christianity wasn't the unified religion we know today. It was a collection of competing beliefs, interpretations, and communities, each claiming to possess the true understanding of Jesus' message. In the great cities of the Roman Empire, different Christian groups gathered in homes, caves, and secret meeting places, sharing their own versions of the gospel story. Among these diverse Christian communities were groups we now call Gnostics. These weren't heretics in the modern sense of the word. They were sincere believers who saw the world through a radically different lens. To them, the material world wasn't God's good creation, but a prison trapping divine sparks of light. Salvation didn't come through Christ's death and resurrection, but through secret knowledge that would allow the soul to escape physical bondage and return to the divine realm. It was within these Gnostic circles that the Gospel of Judas found its audience, and what it said about history's most infamous betrayer was nothing short of revolutionary. According to this forbidden text, Judas wasn't the greedy, demon-possessed villain of traditional accounts. He was Jesus' closest disciple, the only one who truly understood Christ's divine mission. Far from betraying his master out of weakness or evil, Judas was following explicit instructions from Jesus himself. The implications of this reversal are staggering. If Judas was acting on Jesus' orders, then the entire concept of betrayal collapses. If the crucifixion was orchestrated by Jesus himself, then the traditional understanding of sacrifice, atonement, and redemption requires complete re-examination. Most dangerously of all, if Jesus condemned the other disciples and elevated Judas above them, then what does that say about the church that claims authority through apostolic succession? These weren't abstract theological debates. In the rough-and-tumble religious marketplace of the 2nd century, different interpretations of Christianity competed for followers, resources, and legitimacy. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Whichever version of the faith gained imperial support would shape the future of Western civilization. The losers wouldn't just face theological defeat. They would face systematic persecution, exile, and in many cases, death. The early church fathers understood exactly what was at stake. Bishop Irenaeus of Lyons, writing around 180 CE, didn't just disagree with the Gospel of Judas. He attacked it with the fury of someone who saw an existential threat to everything he held sacred. In his influential work Against Heresies, Irenaeus explicitly condemned the text, calling it a fictitious history and linking it to a pattern of inverting biblical villains. To him, this wasn't just another interpretation of Christianity. It was a dangerous perversion that could lead souls to damnation. But here's what makes Irenaeus' condemnation so significant. He was writing about a text that actually existed, that was circulating among Christian communities, and that was influential enough to warrant a systematic response. The Gospel of Judas wasn't some obscure manuscript gathering dust in a forgotten library. It was a living document, being read, copied, and discussed by real believers who saw in it a profound spiritual truth. What happened next reveals the true power of institutional authority when it's threatened. As Christianity moved from persecuted minority to imperial favor under Constantine in the early 4th century, the church gained the secular power to enforce its definitions of orthodoxy. In 367 CE, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria issued his famous Easter letter, which listed for the first time the exact 27 books that would constitute the New Testament canon. Everything else was to be rejected as apocryphal or heretical. This wasn't just about preserving authentic texts. It was about control, determining which versions of Christianity would be remembered and which would be erased from history. The formation of the biblical canon was as much a political act as it was a theological one. Those who controlled the narrative controlled the faith itself. The Gospel of Judas, along with dozens of other alternative Christian texts, was systematically eliminated from monasteries, churches, and private collections. Possession of such texts could result in excommunication or worse. Scribes stopped copying them. Libraries stopped preserving them. And slowly, deliberately, these alternative voices were silenced. Many of these forbidden gospels survived only because they were hidden away, buried in jars in the Egyptian desert or sealed in forgotten caves. The climate of Upper Egypt, with its extreme aridity, created perfect conditions for preserving fragile papyrus and leather. What couldn't survive the flames of persecution could endure centuries beneath the sand, waiting for a time when their message might finally be heard. And that's exactly what happened with the Gospel of Judas. Sometime around 280 CE, as Roman persecution of Christians intensified under Emperor Diocletian, a group of Gnostic believers near the Egyptian town of Carrara, dangerous to keep, made a desperate decision. Their sacred texts were too precious to destroy. So they did what believers throughout history have done when faced with impossible choices. They buried their treasures and trusted in providence. The texts were carefully copied in Coptic, the everyday language of Egyptian Christians, bound together in a leather codex and placed inside a limestone box. This box was then sealed and buried in the Jebel Carrara caves, hidden from the eyes of persecutors and preserved in the arid embrace of the desert. For 17 centuries, the gospel lay forgotten while empires rose and fell. Christianity transformed from persecuted sect to global religion. And the condemnation of Judas hardened into unquestioned truth. The limestone box might have remained hidden forever if not for a chance discovery in the late 1970s. Local farmers digging for fertilizer near the caves stumbled upon an ancient burial site. Among their findings was a sealed limestone container, and inside lay a small leather-bound codex, its pages blackened with age, written in a script the farmers couldn't read. These weren't trained archaeologists or biblical scholars. They were ordinary people trying to make a living from harsh desert soil. They had no idea they'd discovered one of the most controversial documents in Christian history. To them, it was simply an old book that might fetch a good price from dealers who sold antiquities to foreign collectors. What followed was a journey that nearly destroyed this priceless artifact before scholars could decipher its contents. The manuscript entered the shadowy world of the international antiquities market, passing through multiple hands, while slowly deteriorating in improper storage conditions. For over 20 years, it traveled from Egypt to Europe to America, its pages crumbling, its ancient ink fading, its revolutionary message trapped in a codex that fewer and fewer people could read. By the time serious scholars finally gained access to the text in the early 2000s, nearly a fifth of it had been lost to neglect and improper handling. It's heartbreaking to consider this document survived Roman persecution, the systematic destruction of heretical works, and 17 centuries buried in the desert, only to face destruction through modern carelessness and greed. When the National Geographic Society finally assembled a team of world-class experts to authenticate, preserve, and translate the manuscript, what they discovered sent shockwaves through both academic and religious communities. This wasn't just another ancient Christian text. It was a complete alternative narrative of the events leading to the crucifixion, told from the perspective of history's most notorious villain. The authentication process itself reads like a thriller. Carbon-14 dating placed the codex between 220 and 340 CE, making it one of the oldest surviving Christian manuscripts outside the New Testament. Paleographic analysis confirmed the handwriting styles were consistent with 3rd century Coptic scribes. Spectroscopic examination of the ink revealed it was made from carbon-based materials, typical of ancient Egyptian writing implements. Every scientific test pointed to the same conclusion. This wasn't a modern forgery or medieval fabrication. This was the real thing. But even more shocking than the manuscript's authenticity was its content. The Gospel of Judas didn't just offer a different perspective on familiar events. It turned the entire Christian narrative inside out, where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John portrayed Judas as Satan's instrument. This text elevated him as Christ's most enlightened disciple. Where the canonical Gospels depicted the betrayal as humanity's greatest sin, this forbidden gospel presented it as an act of cosmic necessity orchestrated by Jesus himself. The opening lines set the tone for everything that follows. The secret account of the revelation that Jesus spoke in conversation with Judas Iscariot during a week, 3 days before he celebrated Passover. Notice what's missing here. No condemnation, no hint of treachery, just the promise of secret revelation shared between master and most trusted disciple. As the text unfolds, we encounter scenes that would have been unthinkable to traditional Christian readers. Jesus pulls Judas aside, away from the other disciples, speaking to him with particular intimacy. "Step away from the others," Jesus says, "and I shall tell you the mysteries of the kingdom. It is possible for you to reach it, but you will grieve a great deal." This isn't the Jesus of Sunday school lessons, offering comfort and reassurance. This is a figure who understands the terrible burden he's about to place on his closest friend. The grief Jesus speaks of isn't just emotional pain. It's the knowledge that Judas will be reviled throughout history for an act of ultimate obedience. What makes this portrayal so subversive is how it reframes everything we think we know about loyalty and betrayal. In the traditional Christian narrative, the other disciples represent faithfulness, while Judas embodies treachery. But the Gospel of Judas suggests exactly the opposite. Here, The other disciples are portrayed as fundamentally misunderstanding Jesus' message, while Judas alone grasps the cosmic significance of what's about to unfold. The text describes Jesus laughing at the disciples when they pray to their God, because they're unwittingly worshipping what Gnostics called the demiurge, a lesser, flawed deity who created the material world as a prison for divine souls. "Why are you angry in your hearts?" Jesus asked them. "Your God, who is within you, and his powers have provoked anger within your souls." This wasn't just a theological disagreement. It was a direct assault on the foundations of what would become Orthodox Christianity. If Jesus himself was mocking the disciples' understanding of God, what did that say about the church they would eventually establish? If their prayers were misdirected and their worship misguided, how could they claim divine authority? The Gospel of Judas goes even further, presenting a vision where Jesus shows Judas the future of the institutional church. In this prophecy, the disciples are seen leading people astray, offering sacrifices to the false god while claiming divine mandate. The text explicitly condemns the apostolic church that was forming around the other disciples, suggesting that far from being divinely ordained, it was fundamentally corrupted from the beginning. But perhaps the most revolutionary passage comes when Jesus explains to Judas exactly what he's asking him to do. "You will exceed all of them," Christ tells his chosen disciple, "for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." This single sentence encapsulates the entire Gnostic worldview that produced the text. Jesus' physical body isn't his true self, but merely a garment clothing his divine spirit. By helping to remove this garment through death, Judas isn't betraying Jesus. He's helping to fulfill the ultimate purpose of the incarnation. The theological implications are staggering. If Jesus wanted to die, if he specifically instructed Judas to hand him over to the authorities, then the entire concept of sacrificial atonement requires re-examination. In traditional Christian theology, Jesus dies for humanity's sins, offering himself as the perfect sacrifice to satisfy divine justice. But if Jesus orchestrated his own death as a means of escaping physical limitation, then the crucifixion becomes something else entirely. Not a sacrifice for sin, but a liberation from material bondage. This interpretation would have been horrifying to early church fathers for multiple reasons. First, it suggested that the material world, including human bodies, was inherently evil rather than good creation. Second, it implied that salvation came through escape from physical reality, rather than through God's redemptive work within history. Most dangerously of all, it elevated secret knowledge above institutional authority as the path to spiritual truth. The early church was already fighting battles on multiple fronts. Roman authorities viewed Christianity with suspicion, seeing it as a threat to social order and traditional values. Jewish leaders rejected Christian claims about Jesus' messianic identity. Internal divisions threatened to tear the young movement apart before it could establish stable foundations. The last thing church leaders needed was an alternative gospel that undermined their authority and presented a completely different understanding of salvation itself. What makes the suppression of the Gospel of Judas particularly significant is how systematic and successful it was. This wasn't just a matter of theological debate or scholarly disagreement. It was deliberate, coordinated erasure. Church councils condemned Gnostic texts. Imperial edicts ordered their destruction. Monasteries purged their libraries. Private collectors faced excommunication for possession of forbidden works. The success of this campaign can be measured by how completely the Gospel of Judas vanished from historical consciousness. For over 1,500 years, the only evidence of its existence was Irenaeus' brief condemnation in Against Heresies. No medieval theologian quoted from it. No Renaissance scholar mentioned it. No Enlightenment critic used it to challenge church authority. It was as if the text had never existed at all. But texts have a way of refusing to stay buried. Words, once committed to papyrus or parchment, possess a strange kind of immortality. They can lie dormant for centuries, forgotten in desert caves or monastery cellars, only to resurface when historical circumstances align to give them new relevance. The Gospel of Judas is a perfect example of this textual resurrection, emerging from the Egyptian desert at precisely the moment when our culture was ready to hear its message. The timing of the discovery is remarkable when you consider the broader cultural context. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have seen unprecedented questioning of traditional authority structures. Religious institutions face declining membership and credibility crises. Historical narratives once accepted without question are being re-examined through new lenses. Alternative perspectives that were once marginalized are finding new audiences through digital platforms and global communication networks. Into this environment of questioning and skepticism came a text that offered the ultimate alternative perspective, a complete inversion of Christianity's foundational narrative. For those already suspicious of institutional authority, the Gospel of Judas provided powerful ammunition. Here was proof that the Church had actively suppressed inconvenient truths. Here was evidence that alternative versions of Christianity had existed before orthodoxy imposed its rigid boundaries. The Vatican's response to this rediscovered text reveals just how deeply the institution understood its threatening implications. When National Geographic announced the Gospel of Judas translation in 2006, Vatican officials didn't simply dismiss it as a historical curiosity. Their reaction was swift, calculated, and telling. Father Thomas Williams, Dean of Theology at Regina Apostolorum University in Rome, immediately went on the offensive, stating that the discovery wouldn't change church teaching because Judas was a traitor from the beginning. But this response raises a crucial question. Why did they feel the need to respond so forcefully to a supposedly irrelevant ancient text? The answer lies in understanding what the Gospel of Judas represents beyond its specific claims about one biblical figure. This isn't just about rehabilitating a historical villain. It's about challenging the entire framework through which Christianity has understood authority, revelation, and truth itself. Consider what happens to Christian theology if the Gospel of Judas is taken seriously. The traditional narrative depends on clear moral categories. Jesus represents perfect goodness. The disciples, despite their flaws, embody faithful discipleship. Judas serves as the necessary counterpoint, the darkness that defines the light. This framework provides believers with clear guidelines for understanding loyalty, betrayal, and spiritual authenticity. The Gospel of Judas demolishes these comfortable categories. If Jesus' closest disciples fundamentally misunderstood his message, what does that say about the churches they established? If secret knowledge rather than public teaching represents the path to truth, what authority do institutional leaders possess? If the greatest betrayal in history was actually an act of obedience, how do we distinguish faithfulness from treachery? These questions struck at the heart of what scholars call the apostolic succession doctrine. The Catholic Church bases its authority on the claim that Jesus gave special authority to the 12 apostles, who then passed this authority down through successive generations of bishops. This unbroken chain supposedly guarantees that church teaching remains faithful to Jesus' original message. But the Gospel of Judas presents a radically different picture of apostolic authority. Here, the 11 faithful disciples are portrayed as spiritually blind, worshipping false gods and leading future generations astray. Only Judas, the supposed betrayer, receives Jesus' deepest revelations. If this alternative account contains any historical truth, it undermines the entire foundation of ecclesiastical authority. The text's portrayal of Jesus himself proves equally disturbing to orthodox sensibilities. The canonical Gospels present Christ as the suffering servant, willingly accepting death for humanity's salvation. His agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, his cry of abandonment from the cross, his resurrection appearances to the disciples, all emphasize both his humanity and his redemptive mission within history. The Gnostic Jesus of this forbidden gospel operates according to completely different principles. He's not primarily concerned with redeeming the material world, but with escaping it. His death isn't a sacrifice for sin, but a liberation from physical constraint. His resurrection isn't vindication of his earthly mission, but confirmation that divine spirit cannot be contained by material limitation. This theological divergence explains why early church fathers reacted so violently to Gnostic texts. These weren't simply alternative interpretations of familiar themes. They represented a fundamentally different understanding of reality itself. Where Orthodox Christianity affirmed the goodness of creation and God's redemptive work within history, Gnostic Christianity viewed the material world as a cosmic mistake, requiring escape through secret knowledge. The political implications of these competing worldviews were enormous. Orthodox Christianity, with its emphasis on incarnation and redemption within history, could more easily accommodate earthly institutions and social structures. If God worked through material reality, then churches, governments, and social hierarchies could potentially serve divine purposes. Gnostic Christianity, with its emphasis on escape from material bondage through individual enlightenment, posed a direct threat to all forms of institutional authority. If salvation came through personal gnosis rather than sacramental participation, what need was there for priests, bishops, or churches? If the material world was inherently corrupted, what legitimacy could earthly rulers claim? The early church's systematic suppression of Gnostic texts wasn't just theological housekeeping. It was a calculated campaign to eliminate competing visions of Christian identity that threatened the emerging alliance between religious and political authority. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, he wasn't endorsing religion in general. He was backing a specific version of Christianity that could serve imperial purposes. The Gospel of Judas, with its radical individualism and anti-institutional message, could never have served those purposes. Its vision of Christianity was too dangerous, too subversive, too threatening to social order. So it had to disappear, along with dozens of other texts that presented alternative visions of Christian identity. What makes this historical suppression particularly significant is how successful it was for so many centuries. The victors didn't just win the theological debate, they rewrote history itself, creating the impression that their version of Christianity had always been the only authentic option. Alternative voices were not just defeated, but erased from memory. This erasure was so complete that when scholars began recovering Gnostic texts in the 20th century, many Christians reacted with genuine shock. They had never heard of these alternative gospels, never imagined that early Christianity encompassed such diversity of belief and practice. The neat, unified narrative they had inherited suddenly revealed itself as a carefully constructed selection from a much messier historical reality. The discovery of the Gospel of Judas forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how religious truth is established and maintained. If powerful institutions can successfully suppress alternative perspectives for 15 centuries, what other voices have been silenced? How many other alternative narratives lie buried in desert caves or monastery cellars, waiting for accidental discovery? These questions become particularly acute when we consider the Gospel's portrayal of institutional Christianity itself. The text doesn't just rehabilitate Judas, it explicitly condemns the church that would claim authority in his name. In one of the most chilling passages, Jesus shows Judas a vision of the future where the disciples lead people astray, offering false sacrifices while claiming divine mandate. This prophetic condemnation reads like a direct challenge to every Christian institution that has ever claimed apostolic authority. If Jesus himself predicted that the disciples would mislead future generations, how can their successors claim divine sanction for their teachings? How can institutions built on apostolic succession maintain legitimacy if the apostles themselves were fundamentally mistaken about Jesus' message? The Vatican's modern response to these challenges reveals how much the Church's approach has evolved since the age of book burning and heresy trials, Gospel of Judas, Vatican. Rather than attempting to suppress the scholars, have adopted a more sophisticated strategy of containment. They acknowledge the text's historical significance, while firmly rejecting its theological relevance. Cardinal Walter Casper, speaking for the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, captured this approach perfectly when he stated that while the Church welcomed the availability of the text as an important source for understanding early Christianity, it contained elements incompatible with Christian faith. This measured response reflects a recognition that in the information age, suppression is no longer a viable strategy. But this evolution in tactics shouldn't obscure the fundamental tension that remains. The Gospel of Judas continues to pose the same basic challenge to ecclesiastical authority that it presented in the 2nd century. Its alternative vision of Christianity, with its emphasis on individual revelation over institutional mediation, still threatens the foundations upon which religious authority rests. Modern church leaders understand this threat, even if they express it more diplomatically than their ancient predecessors. When they emphasize the text's late date or question its apostolic credentials, they're employing scholarly arguments to achieve the same goal their predecessors sought through fire and sword, neutralizing a dangerous challenge to orthodox authority. Yet the very existence of these arguments reveals how much has changed. The early church could simply condemn heretical texts and order their destruction. Modern religious institutions must engage with alternative perspectives, developing sophisticated responses that acknowledge historical complexity while maintaining theological boundaries. This shift reflects broader changes in how Western culture approaches questions of authority and truth. We live in an age of information abundance, where texts once accessible only to scholarly elites are now available to anyone with internet access. Alternative perspectives that were once easily marginalized can now find global audiences within hours. The Gospel of Judas emerged into this transformed landscape at precisely the right moment. Its alternative narrative of Christianity's foundational events arrived just as traditional religious authority was facing unprecedented challenges from multiple directions. Declining church attendance, sex abuse scandals, scientific discoveries that challenged literal biblical interpretation, and growing religious pluralism had already shaken many people's confidence in institutional Christianity. Into this environment of questioning and doubt came a text that seemed to validate the deepest suspicions about religious authority. Here was proof that the Church had actively suppressed alternative perspectives. Here was evidence that Christianity's origins were far more complex and contested than official histories admitted. Here was a voice from the ancient past that spoke directly to modern concerns about power, truth, and institutional credibility. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for those seeking to challenge traditional Christian authority. The Gospel of Judas provided historical ammunition for contemporary battles over religious authenticity. It offered ancient precedent for modern skepticism about ecclesiastical claims. Most importantly, it suggested that alternative interpretations of Christianity weren't modern innovations, but authentic voices from the faith's earliest period. This convergence of ancient text and contemporary concerns helps explain why the Gospel of Judas generated such intense public interest. Media coverage presented it not just as an archaeological discovery, but as a revelation that could transform our understanding of Christian origins. Television documentaries, magazine articles, and best-selling books brought this obscure ancient text to mainstream attention. The result was a cultural moment that transcended academic scholarship. Millions of people who had never heard of Gnostic Christianity suddenly encountered an alternative version of their faith's foundational narrative. Church leaders found themselves fielding questions they weren't prepared to answer. Seminary professors discovered that students were arriving with preconceptions shaped more by National Geographic specials than by traditional theological training. This popular fascination with the Gospel of Judas reflects deeper currents in contemporary spirituality. Many modern seekers are drawn to forms of faith that emphasize personal experience over institutional authority, mystical insight over doctrinal conformity, and individual revelation over collective tradition. The Gnostic vision presented in this ancient text speaks directly to these contemporary spiritual yearnings. But this modern resonance also creates new dangers for historical understanding. When ancient texts become symbols in contemporary cultural battles, their original contexts and meanings can easily be distorted. The Gospel of Judas risks becoming not a window into 2nd century Gnostic Christianity, but a mirror reflecting 21st century religious anxieties and aspirations. Responsible scholarship requires holding these contemporary interests in tension with historical accuracy. We must take seriously both what the text meant to its original audience and what it might mean to modern readers. This delicate balance becomes particularly challenging when dealing with a document that challenges fundamental assumptions about religious authority and historical truth. The Gospel of Judas thus occupies a unique position in the landscape of Christian studies. It's simultaneously an ancient artifact and a contemporary lightning rod, a historical document and a theological weapon, a scholarly puzzle and a popular sensation. Understanding its full significance requires navigating all these dimensions without losing sight of the central questions it raises about truth, authority, and the complex process through which religious traditions develop and change over time. As scholars continue to debate the implications of this forbidden gospel, we must examine the deeper question that haunts every page of this ancient manuscript. What does it mean for a religious tradition when its most fundamental story gets turned upside down? The answer lies not just in theology, but in the very human psychology of belief itself. Consider how we construct our understanding of right and wrong, good and evil, loyalty and betrayal. These aren't abstract concepts floating in philosophical space. They're deeply personal categories that shape how we see ourselves and others. When someone we've been taught to despise for 2 millennia suddenly appears as a hero, it doesn't just change our understanding of that person. It forces us to question the entire moral framework we've inherited. This psychological dimension explains why the Gospel of Judas continues to provoke such visceral reactions. It's not just challenging historical fact to the stability, it's threatening of moral categories that billions of people use to navigate their daily lives. If Judas wasn't the ultimate betrayer, if his actions were actually heroic, then what other moral certainties might crumble under closer examination? The text's authors understood this psychological power perfectly. They weren't just telling a different story about past events. They were weaponizing narrative itself, using the shock of inversion to break down their readers' existing beliefs and replace them with an entirely different worldview. This wasn't accident or oversight. It was calculated psychological warfare waged through the medium of sacred text. But here's where the story takes an even more sinister turn. The Gospel of Judas doesn't just rehabilitate one biblical villain, it systematically dismantles the entire apostolic foundation of Christianity. In passage after passage, the text portrays the 11 faithful disciples not as heroes, but as spiritual failures who fundamentally misunderstood Jesus' message. The implications are staggering. If the disciples were wrong about Jesus' basic identity and mission, how can churches claiming authority? If Peter's apostolic succession, maintain any, James, and John were spiritually blind, what legitimacy do their supposed successors possess? The Gospel of Judas doesn't just challenge church teaching, it challenges the very right of churches to exist. This explains why the early church fathers reacted with such fury to Gnostic texts. These weren't simply alternative interpretations they could debate and refute through reasoned argument. They were existential threats that struck at the foundation of ecclesiastical power itself. When Bishop Irenaeus condemned the Gospel of Judas as fictitious history, He wasn't engaging in scholarly criticism. He was fighting for institutional survival. The battle lines were clearly drawn. On one side stood the emerging Orthodox Church, with its emphasis on apostolic authority, sacramental grace, and salvation through Christ's death and resurrection. On the other side stood various Gnostic groups, emphasizing individual revelation, escape from material bondage, and salvation through secret knowledge. These weren't just theological differences. They represented completely incompatible visions of what Christianity should become. What makes this ancient conflict particularly relevant to our modern situation is how it parallels contemporary debates about religious authority. Today, just as in the 2nd century, we see tension between institutional claims to exclusive truth and individual assertions of spiritual autonomy. The same questions that divided early Christians continue to divide believers today. Who has the right to interpret sacred texts? How do we distinguish authentic revelation from dangerous delusion? Can religious truth be mediated through institutions, or must it be experienced directly by each individual? The Gospel of Judas speaks directly to these contemporary concerns because it presents the ultimate example of institutional suppression of inconvenient truth. Here was a text that challenged orthodox authority so effectively that it had to be completely erased from historical memory. For 15 centuries, this alternative voice remained silenced while institutional Christianity consolidated its power and defined the boundaries of acceptable belief. But the text's rediscovery in our own era reveals the ultimate futility of trying to suppress ideas through force. What couldn't be destroyed by imperial edicts and ecclesiastical condemnations survived through accidental preservation in the Egyptian Ar desert. The very fetidity made the region inhospitable to human habitation, created perfect conditions for preserving fragile papyrus and leather. This irony shouldn't be lost on us. The institutional church, with all its wealth, power, and organizational sophistication, couldn't permanently silence a small community of believers who buried their sacred texts in limestone boxes. The desert, indifferent to human schemes and power struggles, preserved what human authority tried to destroy. There's something almost poetic about this reversal, as if the natural world itself was conspiring to ensure that suppressed voices would eventually be heard. When those voices finally emerged in the modern world, they arrived at precisely the moment when Western culture was most ready to hear their message. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have witnessed unprecedented questioning of traditional authority structures across all domains of human experience. Political, religious, educational, and media institutions that once done command now face constant questioned respect, scrutiny, anicism. Into this environment of institutional crisis came the Gospel of Judas, offering historical precedent for modern suspicions about religious authority. The text seemed to validate what many contemporary critics had long suspected, that churches had actively suppressed alternative perspectives to maintain their monopoly on spiritual truth. Here was smoking gun evidence that Christianity's origins were far messier and more contested than official histories admitted. The timing was perfect for maximum cultural impact. Dan Brown's best-selling novel, The Da Vinci Code, published just 2 years before the Gospel of Judas translation, had already primed millions of readers to expect revelations about church suppression of inconvenient truths. When National Geographic announced their discovery, it seemed to confirm fiction's most dramatic claims about hidden gospels and ecclesiastical cover-ups. This cultural moment created a perfect storm of scholarly revelation, popular fascination, and institutional anxiety. The Vatican found itself in an impossible position. They couldn't simply dismiss the text as fantasy because its authenticity was verified by rigorous scientific analysis. They couldn't suppress discussion of its contents because the information age made such suppression impossible. All they could do was engage in damage control, acknowledging the text's historical significance while firmly rejecting its theological implications. The Church's response revealed just how much the landscape of religious authority had changed since the age of book burning and heresy trials. Where their predecessors could silence alternative voices through force, modern religious had to rely leaders on persuasion, scholarly argument, and appeals to tradition shift from co. This erasure to persuasion represents one of the most significant transformations in the history of religious authority. Yet beneath this evolution in tactics, the fundamental tension remained unchanged. The Gospel of Judas posed the same basic challenge to ecclesiastical power that it had presented in the 2nd century. Its vision of Christianity, with individual revelation taking precedence over institutional mediation, still threatened the foundations upon which religious authority rested. The only difference was that modern church leaders had to respond with arguments rather than armies. This constraint actually made their task more some ways. It difficultens relatively easy to suppress a text when you have imperial backing, and can its destruction. It simply orders much harder to refute a text when you must engage with its actual contents and address its specific claims. The Vatican's scholars found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to explain why a document that portrayed itself as Jesus' secret teaching should be rejected in favor of texts written by people who, according to this same document, fundamentally misunderstood their master's message. The theological implications of this dilemma extend far beyond questions about one ancient text. If the Gospel of Judas is taken seriously, it raises profound questions about how religious truth is established and maintained. Traditional Christianity has always claimed that divine revelation was transmitted faithfully from Jesus through the apostles to successive generations of church leaders. This chain of transmission supposedly guarantees that orthodox teaching remains authentic to its Judas suggests divine source. But the gospel of a radically different picture of how works. Instead of revelation of being transmitted through institutional channels, spiritual truth is presented as something that must be discovered individually through mystical insight. The text implies that Jesus shared his deepest teachings not with the group that would become the institutional church, but with the one disciple who was spiritually prepared to receive them. This understanding of revelation has profound implications for religious authority. If truth comes through individual enlightenment rather than institutional transmission, then churches lose their claim to exclusive interpretive authority. Anyone who achieves the proper level of spiritual insight becomes qualified to understand divine truth, regardless of their position within ecclesiastical hierarchies. The early church fathers understood these implications perfectly, which explains their violent reaction to Gnostic texts. They weren't just defending theological positions, they were protecting institutional structures that would collapse if alternative understandings of revelation gained widespread acceptance. The systematic suppression of Gnostic literature wasn't theological housekeeping, it was institutional self-preservation. This historical perspective helps us understand why the rediscovery of the Gospel of Judas created such controversy in our own time. The text arrived bearing the same revolutionary implications that had made it so dangerous in the ancient world. Its vision of individual spiritual authority over institutional mediation spoke directly to contemporary anxieties about religious hierarchy and ecclesiastical control. For many modern readers, the Gospel of Judas became a symbol of authentic spirituality suppressed by corrupt institutions. They saw in its ancient pages validation for their own struggles with religious authority. If Jesus himself had condemned the disciples who had established the institutional church, then contemporary critics of religious hierarchy could claim ancient precedent for their positions. This symbolic power explains why the text generated such intense public interest despite its fragmentary condition and scholarly complexity. Most people who heard about the Gospel of Judas never actually read its contents. They didn't need to. The basic narrative of suppressed truth and institutional cover-up was compelling enough to capture their imagination and confirm their existing suspicions about religious authority. But this popular fascination also created new dangers for historical understanding. When ancient texts become weapons in contemporary culture wars, their original meanings can easily be distorted. The Gospel of Judas risked becoming not a window into 2nd century Christianity, but a mirror reflecting 21st century religious anxieties. Scholars found themselves caught, serious, between competing pressures. On one hand, they had professional obligations to analyze the text within its proper historical context, examining what it meant to its original authors and readers. On the other hand, they faced enormous public interest in what the text might mean for contemporary Christianity and religious authority more generally. This tension between historical accuracy and contemporary relevance has characterized scholarly work on the Gospel of Judas from the beginning. The initial National Geographic translation emphasized passages that seemed to portray Judas heroically, playing up the sensational aspects that would generate maximum public interest. Later scholarly work revealed a more nuanced picture, with some passages actually condemning Judas more harshly than the canonical Gospels. These translation controversies highlighted how much interpretation shapes our understanding of ancient texts. Different scholarly choices about ambiguous phrases could transform the Gospel of Judas from a text that elevated its namesake to one that condemned him even more severely than traditional accounts. If professional scholars could disagree so profoundly about basic meaning, what hope did ordinary readers have of understanding the text's true significance? The answer lies in recognizing that ancient texts, especially fragmentary ones from radically different cultural contexts, rarely yield simple, unambiguous meanings. The Gospel of Judas is neither a straightforward rehabilitation of its namesake, nor a simple condemnation. Like most sophisticated ancient literature, it presents a complex, multifaceted portrait that resists easy categorization. This complexity actually makes the text more historically valuable, not less. Simple propaganda pieces rarely survive the test of time because they lack the depth to speak to changing circumstances. But texts that grapple seriously with fundamental human questions about loyalty, betrayal, authority, and truth can continue to generate new insights across centuries and cultures. The Gospel of Judas has demonstrated this kind of enduring relevance precisely because it refuses to provide simple answers to complex questions. Its portrayal of the betrayer as simultaneously condemned and elevated captures something essential about the human condition that transcends its specific historical context. We all live with the tension between competing loyalties. We all face situations where doing the right thing requires accepting misunderstanding or condemnation from others. This universal dimension helps explain why the text continues to fascinate readers who have no particular interest in early Christian theology or Gnostic philosophy. The basic narrative of someone who accepts a terrible burden out of loyalty to a higher cause resonates across religious and cultural boundaries. It speaks to something fundamental about moral courage and the price of integrity. Yet this universal appeal shouldn't obscure the text's specific historical significance as evidence for the diversity of early Christianity. The Gospel of Judas provides a window into a world where competing interpretations of Jesus' message coexisted before institutional orthodoxy narrowed the acceptable range of belief. It reminds us that the Christianity we know today emerged from a much messier historical process than traditional accounts suggest. This historical perspective has profound implications for how we understand religious authority and institutional claims to exclusive truth. If early Christianity encompassed such radical diversity, if alternative interpretations existed from the very beginning, then modern churches must grapple with the question of what gives their particular version of the faith unique legitimacy. The traditional answer has always been apostolic succession. Orthodox Christianity claims that its teachings represent the faithful transmission of divine revelation from Jesus through the apostles to successive generations of church leaders. This unbroken chain supposedly guarantees theological authenticity and provides the foundation for ecclesiastical authority. But the gospel of this narrative Judas challenges by suggesting that the apostles themselves were spiritually blind, that they fundamentally misunderstood Jesus' message, and that the church they established was built on false foundations. If these claims have any historical validity, they undermine the entire framework of apostolic authority upon which Orthodox Christianity depends. Modern church leaders have responded to this challenge by emphasizing the late date of the Gospel of Judas and questioning its historical reliability. They point out that the text was written at least a century after the canonical Gospels and reflects the theological developments of second-century Gnostic communities rather than authentic first-century traditions. These arguments have scholarly merit. The Gospel of Judas clearly emerges from a later historical context and reflects theological concerns that developed well after the time of Jesus and the original apostles. It cannot be read as a straightforward historical account of what actually happened between Jesus and Judas during the final week before the crucifixion. But acknowledging the text's late date and theological sophistication doesn't necessarily diminish its historical significance. Even if the Gospel of Judas doesn't provide reliable information about Jesus himself, it offers valuable evidence for how some early Christians understood his message and significance. It reveals that alternative interpretations of the Christ event existed within living memory of the apostolic period. More importantly, it demonstrates that the process of defining Christian orthodoxy was far more complex and contested than traditional accounts suggest. The version of Christianity that eventually triumphed didn't simply preserve authentic apostolic tradition while rejecting false innovations. It emerged from a long process of debate, conflict, and institutional consolidation that involved real choices between competing alternatives. Understanding this historical complexity doesn't necessarily undermine religious faith, but it does complicate simple appeals to apostolic authority. If multiple interpretations of Jesus' message existed from early in Christian history, then claims to represent the one authentic apostolic tradition become more difficult to sustain. Religious authority must find new foundations that can acknowledge historical complexity while maintaining theological coherence. This challenge becomes particularly acute in our contemporary context where information about alternative Christian traditions is more widely available than ever before. The Gospel of Judas is just one of many ancient texts that have been rediscovered and made accessible to general audiences. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of early Christian diversity, making it increasingly difficult to maintain narratives of simple linear development, from Jesus to modern orthodoxy. The cumulative effect of these discoveries has been to reveal early Christianity as a much more diverse and contested phenomenon than most believers were taught to expect. This revelation has created both opportunities and dangers for contemporary faith communities. On the positive side, it opens up possibilities for more sophisticated theological reflection that can engage honestly with historical complexity. On the negative side, it can undermine the confidence of believers who were never prepared to grapple with suchiguity. The Gospel of Judas thus stands at the center of broader conversations about how religious traditions should relate to their own histories. Should churches emphasize continuity with the past, downplaying evidence of diversity and change? Or should they embrace historical complexity as a source of enrichment rather than threat? How can institutions maintain coherent identity while acknowledging that their foundations are more contested than previously assumed? These questions don't have simple answers, but they cannot be avoided in an age when suppression of inconvenient evidence is no longer possible. The Gospel of Judas has emerged from its limestone tomb to join a growing chorus of ancient voices that demand to be heard. Together, they are forcing scholars, both and believers, to develop more nuanced understandings of how religious traditions develop and change over time. What emerges from this complex historical landscape is a profound question that extends far beyond academic debate. If the foundations of Christian orthodoxy were more contested than we've been taught, what does that mean for the billions of believers who have built their lives on these teachings? The Gospel of Judas forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that religious truth isn't discovered in a vacuum. It's shaped by human decisions, political pressures, and institutional needs. This realization becomes particularly unsettling when we examine how the early church made its fateful choices about which texts to preserve and which to destroy. The process wasn't guided by some mystical divine intervention that automatically separated truth from falsehood. It was a messy human enterprise involving bishops with competing agendas, emperors with political calculations, and communities struggling to define their identity in a hostile world. Consider the criteria the Church Fathers used to distinguish orthodox from heretical texts. They emphasized apostolic authorship, but the Gospel of Judas claimed to be based on Jesus' direct revelations to one of the 12. They stressed early dating, but many canonical texts reached their final form decades after the events they described. They highlighted consistency with established teaching, but that created a circular logic where texts were rejected for disagreeing with positions that were still being formulated. What really determined which texts survived wasn't their inherent truthfulness or divine inspiration. It was their compatibility with the institutional structures that were emerging in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Texts that supported hierarchical authority and sacramental mediation were preserved. Those that emphasized individual revelation and direct spiritual experience were condemned as dangerous to church order. The Gospel of Judas fell squarely into the latter category. Its vision of Christianity posed an existential threat to the institutional model that was gaining dominance throughout the Roman Empire. If ordinary believers could access divine truth through personal gnosis, why would they need priests to mediate their relationship with God? If the apostles themselves had misunderstood Jesus' message, what authority did their supposed successors possess? These weren't abstract theological questions. They struck at the economic and political foundations of the emerging church. By the 4th century, Christianity had become a significant social force with vast resources, elaborate hierarchies, and close ties to imperial power. Alternative visions of the faith that undermined these institutional structures weren't just theologically problematic, they were economically and politically dangerous. The systematic suppression of Gnostic texts thus served multiple purposes simultaneously. It eliminated theological competitors, consolidated ecclesiastical authority, and removed ideological threats to the Church's growing worldly power. What was presented as the defense of divine truth was actually the triumph of one particular institutional model over its alternatives. This perspective doesn't necessarily invalidate Orthodox Christianity or prove that the Gnostic alternatives were superior. But it does reveal how human the process of establishing religious authority really was. The version of Christianity that survived and dominated wasn't preserved by divine providence working through history. It was constructed through very human processes of debate, conflict, and institutional consolidation. Understanding this historical reality creates profound challenges for contemporary believers and religious leaders alike. How do you maintain confidence in teachings that were established through such contested processes? How do you distinguish divine revelation from human construction when the two seem so thoroughly intertwined? These questions become even more pressing when we consider that the same institutional dynamics continue to operate today. Modern religious authorities still make choices about which voices to amplify and which to marginalize. They still decide which interpretations of sacred texts are acceptable and which cross the line into dangerous territory. The methods may have evolved from book burning to academic marginalization, but the basic dynamic of institutional gatekeeping remains unchanged. The Gospel of Judas serves as a powerful reminder that these contemporary choices have ancient precedents. When church leaders today dismiss alternative interpretations of Christian teaching, they're following patterns established by their predecessors who condemned Gnostic texts as heretical. The question becomes whether historical precedent justifies current practice, or whether it reveals the arbitrary nature of institutional authority. This dilemma becomes particularly acute when we examine the specific content of the suppressed tradition represented by the Gospel of Judas. The text presents a vision of Christianity that might actually be more appealing to many contemporary seekers than orthodox alternatives. Its emphasis on individual spiritual experience over institutional mediation resonates with modern values of personal autonomy and authentic self-discovery. The Gnostic understanding of salvation through knowledge rather than faith alone appeals to intellectually oriented believers who struggle with traditional doctrines that seem to require the suspension of critical thinking. The text's sophisticated engagement with questions about the nature of reality and consciousness speaks to contemporary interests in psychology, philosophy, and even quantum physics. Most significantly, the Gospel's inversion of traditional moral categories offers a refreshing alternative to the black and white thinking that characterizes much contemporary religious discourse. In a world where complexity and nuance are increasingly valued, the text's portrayal of Judas as simultaneously condemned and elevated provides a more sophisticated model for understanding moral ambiguity. These modern resonances help explain why the Gospel of Judas generated such intense public interest despite its fragmentary condition and scholarly complexity. Many contemporary readers saw in its ancient pages a vision of Christianity that spoke more directly to their spiritual needs than the institutional alternatives they encountered in traditional churches. This popular fascination created new challenges for religious authorities who found themselves defending positions that seemed increasingly archaic to modern sensibilities. Why should individual spiritual experience be subordinated to institutional authority? Why should ancient texts be privileged over contemporary revelations? Why should complex moral questions be reduced to simple categories of good and evil? The Vatican's response to these challenges revealed both the evolution and the limitations of ecclesiastical strategy in the information age. Church leaders acknowledged the historical significance of the Gospel of Judas while firmly rejecting its theological implications. They engaged with scholarly arguments about dating and authenticity while maintaining that Orthodox tradition represented the only legitimate interpretation of Christian origins. This measured approach reflected a recognition that crude suppression was no longer viable in contemporary cultural contexts, but it also revealed the fundamental conservatism of institutional religion when faced with challenges to its authority. Despite their sophisticated rhetoric, church leaders were essentially making the same arguments their predecessors had used to justify burning heretical texts. Orthodox tradition represents divine truth, while alternatives represent dangerous deviations. The problem with this position becomes apparent when we examine the historical processes through which Orthodox tradition was established. If the early church made choices between competing alternatives based partly on political and institutional considerations, then claims about divine guidance in establishing orthodoxy become more difficult to sustain. The tradition that survived wasn't necessarily the most truthful or spiritually valuable. It was the most politically successful. This realization opens up disturbing possibilities about what else might have been lost through the systematic suppression of alternative voices. The Gospel of Judas is just one text among many that were condemned and destroyed by the early church. Scholars estimate that dozens of alternative gospels, letters, and apocalypses were eliminated during the formation of the biblical canon. What spiritual insights might have been preserved in those lost texts? What alternative understandings of Jesus' message might have enriched rather than threatened Orthodox faith? What models of Christian community and practice might have developed if institutional considerations hadn't determined which voices were allowed to survive? These questions can never be answered definitively because the evidence was systematically destroyed. But the fragments that do survive, like the Gospel of Judas, provide tantalizing glimpses of what was lost. They reveal a richness and diversity in early Christian thought that makes the later narrowing of orthodoxy seem like an impoverishment rather than a purification. This perspective has profound implications for how contemporary believers relate to their religious traditions. If Orthodox Christianity represents not the pure preservation of divine revelation, but the victory of one institutional model over its alternatives, then modern faith communities must grapple with questions about authority, authenticity, and spiritual truth that their leaders would prefer to avoid. The Gospel of Judas thus functions as more than just an ancient artifact or theological curiosity. It serves as a mirror reflecting contemporary anxieties about religious authority and institutional credibility. Its alternative vision of Christianity challenges believers to consider what their faith might look like if different historical choices had been made, if different voices had been preserved, if different models of spiritual community had developed. These aren't merely academic questions. They touch on fundamental issues of meaning, identity, and ultimate truth that shape how people understand their place in the universe. When ancient texts surface that challenge received wisdom about these ultimate questions, they create ripple effects that extend far beyond scholarly conferences and theological seminaries. The popular response to the Gospel of Judas demonstrated this broader cultural significance. Millions of people who had never heard of Gnostic Christianity suddenly found themselves questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine. Seminary students arrived in classrooms with preconceptions shaped more by National Geographic documentaries than traditional theological education. Parish priests fielded questions about alternative gospels and church authority that they weren't prepared to answer. This cultural moment revealed how hungry contemporary audiences were for alternatives to conventional religious narratives. The Gospel of Judas provided historical precedent for modern skepticism about institutional authority, while offering a more sophisticated understanding of moral complexity than traditional good versus evil frameworks. But this popular enthusiasm also created dangers for serious historical understanding. When ancient texts become symbols in contemporary culture wars, their original meanings can be distorted or lost entirely. The Gospel of Judas risked becoming not a window into 2nd century Christianity, but a weapon in 21st century battles over religious authority. Responsible engagement with this ancient text requires holding multiple perspectives in tension simultaneously. We must take seriously both its original historical context and its contemporary significance, both its limitations as historical evidence and its value as spiritual literature, both its challenge to orthodox authority and its own particular theological agenda. This balanced approach reveals the Gospel of Judas to be neither the lost key to authentic Christianity, nor a dangerous distraction from orthodox truth. Instead, it emerges as a complex document that provides valuable insight into the diversity of early Christian thought, while raising profound questions about how religious traditions develop and change over time. The text's portrayal of Judas as simultaneously the most faithful and most condemned of the disciples captures something essential about the human condition that transcends its specific historical context. We all face situations where doing what we believe is right requires accepting misunderstanding or condemnation from others. We all struggle with competing loyalties and conflicting moral obligations. This universal dimension helps explain why the gospel continues to fascinate readers across religious and cultural boundaries. Its exploration of themes like loyalty, betrayal, sacrifice, and moral courage speaks to fundamental human experiences that aren't limited to any particular faith tradition or historical period. Yet this universal appeal shouldn't obscure the text's specific significance as evidence for early Christian diversity. The Gospel of Judas provides concrete documentation that alternative interpretations of Jesus' message existed within the first few centuries of Christian history. It demonstrates that the process of establishing orthodox doctrine was more complex and contested than traditional accounts suggest. This historical perspective has important implications for contemporary discussions about religious authority and scriptural interpretation. If early Christianity encompassed such radical diversity, if competing versions of the faith coexisted before institutional orthodoxy imposed its boundaries, then modern claims about exclusive apostolic authority become more difficult to sustain. The challenge isn't necessarily to abandon Orthodox Christianity in favor of Gnostic alternatives. Rather, it's to develop more sophisticated understandings of how religious traditions develop that can acknowledge historical complexity while maintaining theological coherence. This requires moving beyond simple narratives of linear transmission from divine revelation to contemporary doctrine toward more nuanced models that recognize the human dimensions of religious development. Such nuanced understanding might actually strengthen rather than weaken contemporary faith by grounding it in more honest engagement with historical evidence. Believers who understand how their traditions developed through complex processes of debate and institutional consolidation might be better equipped to navigate contemporary challenges than those who expect simple answers to complex questions. The Gospel of Judas thus offers both warning and opportunity for contemporary religious communities. Its suppression demonstrates the dangers of institutional authorities who try to control truth through the elimination of alternative voices. But its survival and rediscovery also reveal the ultimate futility of such attempts at suppression. In an age of information abundance, religious institutions can no longer maintain their authority through the control of access to alternative perspectives. The texts that were once confined to scholarly archives are now available to anyone with internet access. Alternative interpretations that were once easily marginalized can now find global audiences within hours. This transformed landscape requires religious leaders to develop new models of authority that can acknowledge historical complexity while maintaining institutional coherence. They must learn to engage with alternative perspectives rather than simply condemning them, to address challenges through reasoned argument rather than institutional pressure. The Vatican's response to the Gospel of Judas provides a model for this kind of sophisticated engagement. By acknowledging the text's historical significance while firmly rejecting its theological implications, church leaders demonstrated that institutional authority could adapt to new challenges without abandoning core commitments. But this evolution in tactics shouldn't obscure the fundamental tensions that remain unresolved. The Gospel of Judas continues to pose the same basic challenge to ecclesiastical authority that it presented in the 2nd century. Its vision of Christianity, with individual revelation taking precedence over institutional mediation, still threatens the foundations upon which religious authority rests. These tensions reflect deeper questions about the nature of religious truth itself that extend far beyond Christianity to encompass all institutional forms of spirituality. How do we balance respect for tradition with openness to new insights? How do we distinguish authentic spiritual experience from dangerous delusion? How do we maintain community coherence while honoring individual spiritual autonomy? The Gospel of Judas doesn't provide simple answers to these complex questions, but it does offer a powerful reminder that they aren't new questions. The same tensions that divide contemporary believers also divided their ancient predecessors. The same challenges that face modern religious institutions also confronted their historical antecedents. This historical perspective can be both humbling and encouraging. Humbling because it reveals that our current struggles aren't unique or easily resolved. Encouraging because it demonstrates that religious traditions have survived similar challenges before and can potentially do so again. The key insight emerging from engagement with texts like the Gospel of Judas is that religious traditions are more resilient than their defenders often assume. Orthodox Christianity didn't collapse when alternative gospels were rediscovered in the 20th century. Jewish and Islamic traditions haven't been destroyed by historical criticism of their foundational texts. Religious communities have proven capable of adapting to new evidence while maintaining their essential identity. This adaptive capacity suggests that contemporary believers and religious leaders might have less to fear from alternative perspectives than they sometimes assume. Engaging seriously with texts like the Gospel of Judas doesn't necessarily threaten Orthodox faith. It might actually strengthen it by providing deeper understanding of how religious traditions develop and what gives them lasting value. The ultimate significance of the Gospel of Judas may lie not in its specific claims about one biblical figure, but in what it reveals about the ongoing human quest for meaning and truth. Its survival against overwhelming odds testifies to the persistence of alternative voices, even when they're systematically suppressed. Its contemporary resonance demonstrates the enduring relevance of questions about authority, authenticity, and spiritual truth. As we continue to grapple with these perennial questions in our own historical context, the Gospel of Judas serves as both artifact and inspiration. It reminds us that the search for truth requires courage to question received wisdom, patience to engage with complexity, and humility to acknowledge the limitations of our own perspectives. The forbidden gospel refuses to remain buried, not because it contains the final answer to ultimate questions, but because it embodies the human refusal to stop asking them. In its persistence across 17 centuries, from ancient scriptoriums to modern museums, it testifies to something indomitable in the human spirit that continues to seek, question, and hope for deeper understanding. This is perhaps the most profound lesson the Gospel of Judas offers to contemporary readers. Truth cannot be controlled through institutional authority or suppressed through systematic destruction. It has a way of surfacing when historical circumstances align, of speaking comfortable assumptions and forcing deeper reflection. The limestone box buried in the Egyptian to new audiences across cultural and temporal boundaries, of challenging desert, contained more than just an ancient manuscript. It held a challenge to every generation of believers to remain open to new insights, to question inherited assumptions, and to seek truth wherever it might lead, even when that search requires courage to venture into forbidden territory. In our own age of information, abundance, and institutional crisis, this ancient message resonates with particular power. We live in a time when traditional authorities face unprecedented challenges, when alternative perspectives multiply exponentially, when the boundaries between orthodox and heretical become increasingly blurred. The Gospel of Judas emerged from its desert tomb at precisely the moment when these contemporary dynamics had reached critical mass. Its alternative vision of Christianity's foundational narrative arrived just as millions of believers were already questioning traditional religious authority and seeking more authentic forms of spiritual expression. This convergence of ancient text and contemporary concerns creates both opportunities and dangers for serious engagement with religious questions. On the positive side, it opens up possibilities for more sophisticated theological reflection that can integrate historical complexity with spiritual insight. On the negative side, it risks reducing profound questions about ultimate meaning to simple battles between institutional authority and individual autonomy. Navigating these complex dynamics requires the kind of nuanced thinking that the Gospel of Judas itself embodies. Like its portrayal of Judas as simultaneously faithful and condemned, our engagement with religious tradition must acknowledge both its value and its limitations, both its insights and its blind spots, both its continuity and its capacity for change. The manuscript that emerged from that limestone tomb didn't just challenge individual beliefs, it shattered the very architecture of religious certainty that had stood for nearly 2 millennia. When scholars first laid eyes on those blackened pages in climate-controlled laboratories, they weren't just examining ancient papyrus, they were witnessing the resurrection of a voice that had been systematically erased from human memory. But here's what makes this story even more extraordinary. The Gospel of Judas didn't surface in isolation. It was part of a broader archaeological awakening that began in the mid-20th century, a period when the desert sands of Egypt and the caves of Palestine began yielding their secrets with unprecedented frequency. The Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945. Text after text emerged from their ancient hiding places, each one adding another piece to a puzzle that revealed early Christianity to be far more diverse, complex, and contested than anyone had imagined. The timing wasn't coincidental. These discoveries coincided with a broader cultural shift in how Western civilization approached questions of authority and truth. The same decades that saw ancient gospels emerging from desert caves also witnessed the civil rights movement challenging racial orthodoxies, feminism questioning gender hierarchies, and student protests confronting academic and political establishments. Authority itself was under siege across multiple fronts. Into this environment of systematic questioning came texts that seemed to validate the deepest suspicions about institutional power. The Gospel of Judas wasn't just another archaeological artifact. It was ammunition in a larger cultural war about who gets to determine truth and how that determination is made. For critics of religious authority, it provided historical precedent for their contemporary battles. For defenders of orthodox tradition, it represented a dangerous threat that required immediate containment. This cultural dimension helps explain why the text generated such passionate responses from all sides. Biblical scholars found themselves thrust into public debates they had never anticipated. Seminary professors discovered that their students arrived with preconceptions shaped more by media coverage than traditional theological education. Parish priests fielded questions about alternative gospels and institutional credibility that their training hadn't prepared them to address. The Vatican's response revealed just how seriously they understood the threat. This wasn't the measured reaction of an institution confident in its authority. This was the careful maneuvering of an organization that recognized it was fighting for its theological life. When Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict XV, addressed the controversy, his words carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. The Church's strategy was sophisticated and multi-layered. They acknowledged the text's antiquity while questioning its authenticity. They praised scholarly investigation while dismissing theological implications. They welcomed historical inquiry while firmly maintaining doctrinal boundaries. It was a masterclass in institutional damage control, designed to contain the controversy without appearing to suppress legitimate scholarship. But beneath this diplomatic surface lay deeper anxieties that church officials couldn't entirely conceal. The Gospel of Judas represented something more threatening than just another alternative interpretation of Christian origins. It embodied a completely different understanding of how spiritual truth is discovered and transmitted. Where Orthodox Christianity emphasized the faithful preservation of apostolic tradition through institutional channels, this forbidden gospel suggested that the most profound spiritual insights came through individual revelation that often contradicted official teaching. This wasn't just a disagreement about historical facts. It was a fundamental challenge to the epistemological foundations of religious authority itself. If Jesus had shared his deepest secrets with the disciple who would be remembered as history's greatest traitor, what did that say about the reliability of institutional discernment? If the apostles who established the church had fundamentally misunderstood their master's message, how could their successors claim divine guidance in interpreting that same message? These questions struck at the heart of what theologians call the deposit of faith, the belief that divine revelation was fully disclosed through Jesus Christ and faithfully transmitted through apostolic succession to the present day. The Gospel of Judas suggested instead that spiritual truth was an ongoing discovery process that might lead individual seekers to insights that contradicted official doctrine. The implications extended far beyond academic theology into the practical realm of religious authority and institutional control. If ordinary believers could access divine truth through personal spiritual experience, what need was there for elaborate ecclesiastical hierarchies? If secret knowledge rather than public sacraments provided the path to salvation, why would anyone submit to priestly mediation or episcopal oversight? These weren't hypothetical concerns for church leaders who had witnessed the dramatic decline in religious authority throughout the 20th century. Attendance was dropping, vocations were declining, and believers were increasingly willing to pick and choose which teachings they would accept. The last thing institutional Christianity needed was an ancient text that seemed to legitimize individual spiritual autonomy over ecclesiastical authority. The response from Protestant denominations proved equally revealing, though often more fragmented due to their decentralized structure. Some evangelical leaders dismissed the Gospel of Judas as satanic deception designed to undermine biblical truth. Others saw it as confirmation of their long-standing criticisms of Catholic claims to apostolic succession. Still others recognized it as a challenge to all forms of institutional Christianity, including their own. What emerged from these varied responses was a complex portrait of modern Christianity grappling with questions it had assumed were settled centuries ago. The rediscovery of alternative gospels forced believers and leaders alike to confront the messy realities of their tradition's historical development. The clean narrative of linear transmission from Jesus through the apostles to contemporary churches gave way to a more complicated picture of competing interpretations, political calculations, and institutional consolidation. This historical complexity created both opportunities and dangers for contemporary faith communities. On one hand, it opened possibilities for more sophisticated theological reflection that could acknowledge diversity while maintaining coherence. On the other hand, it risked undermining the confidence of believers who had never been prepared to navigate such ambiguity. The scholarly community found itself caught in the middle of these competing pressures. Professional historians and biblical critics had obligations to analyze ancient texts within their proper historical context, examining what they meant to their original authors and audiences. But they also faced enormous public interest in what these texts might mean for contemporary Christianity and religious authority more generally. This tension between historical accuracy and contemporary relevance characterized scholarly work on the Gospel of Judas from its initial publication. Early translations emphasized passages that seemed to portray Judas heroically, playing up sensational aspects that would generate maximum public attention. Later scholarly work revealed more nuanced interpretations, with some passages actually condemning Judas more severely than the canonical Gospels ever did. These translation controversies highlighted fundamental challenges in interpreting ancient texts, especially fragmentary ones from radically different cultural contexts. When nearly a third of a manuscript is missing or illegible, scholars must make educated guesses about context and meaning. These interpretive decisions inevitably reflect the translator's own assumptions, training, and cultural background. The result was multiple competing versions of what the Gospel of Judas actually said about its namesake. Some scholars read it as a complete rehabilitation of the betrayer, transforming him from villain to hero. Others saw it as an even harsher condemnation, portraying Judas as a cosmic villain whose actions served evil purposes despite appearing to help Jesus. Still others found in it a complex, ambiguous portrait that resisted simple moral categorization. This interpretive uncertainty actually made the text more historically valuable, not less. Simple propaganda pieces rarely survive the test of time because they lack the depth to speak to changing circumstances. But texts that grapple seriously with fundamental human questions about loyalty, betrayal, authority, and truth can continue to generate new insights across centuries and cultures. The Gospel of Judas demonstrated this kind of enduring relevance precisely because it refused to provide simple answers to complex questions. Its portrayal of the betrayer as simultaneously essential and condemned captured something fundamental about moral ambiguity that transcends specific historical contexts. We all live with competing loyalties. We all face situations where doing what we believe is right requires accepting misunderstanding or condemnation from others. This psychological dimension helps explain why the text continued to fascinate readers who had no particular interest in early Christian theology or Gnostic philosophy. The basic narrative of someone who accepts a terrible burden out of loyalty to a higher purpose resonates across religious and cultural boundaries. It speaks to universal human experiences of sacrifice, misunderstanding, and moral complexity. Yet this contemporary resonance also created new dangers for historical understanding. When ancient texts become symbols in modern culture wars, their original meanings can be distorted or lost entirely. The Gospel of Judas risked becoming not a window into 2nd century Christianity, but a mirror reflecting 21st century anxieties about authority, truth, and institutional credibility. Responsible scholarship required holding these competing interests in careful balance. Scholars needed to take seriously both what the text meant to its original Gnostic audience and what it might mean to contemporary readers struggling with questions about religious authority. This delicate equilibrium became particularly challenging when dealing with a document that directly challenged fundamental assumptions about Christian origins and development. The broader implications of the Gospel of Judas extended far beyond Christianity to encompass questions about how all religious traditions relate to their own histories. Should communities emphasize continuity with the past, downplaying evidence of diversity and change? Or should they embrace historical complexity as a source of enrichment rather than threat? How can institutions maintain coherent identity while acknowledging that their foundations are more contested than previously assumed? These questions became particularly acute in an age when information about alternative religious traditions was more widely available than ever before. The Gospel of Judas was just one of many ancient texts that had been rediscovered and made accessible to general audiences through digital technology and mass media. Each new discovery added another piece to the puzzle of early Christian diversity, making it increasingly difficult to maintain simple narratives of linear development from Jesus to modern orthodoxy. The cumulative effect of these discoveries was to reveal early Christianity as a much more diverse and contested phenomenon than most believers had been taught to expect. This revelation created both opportunities and challenges for contemporary faith communities. It opened possibilities for more nuanced theological reflection, while potentially undermining the confidence of believers who were unprepared for such complexity. The Gospel of Judas stood at the center of these broader conversations about religious tradition and historical accuracy. Its emergence from the desert coincided with a cultural moment when Western society was already questioning traditional sources of authority across multiple domains. Religious institutions, political establishments, educational hierarchies, and media organizations all faced unprecedented challenges to their credibility and legitimacy. Into this environment of institutional crisis came an ancient text that seemed to validate contemporary suspicions about religious authority. The Gospel provided historical precedent for modern skepticism about ecclesiastical claims, while offering a more sophisticated understanding of moral complexity than traditional frameworks allowed. Its alternative vision of Christianity spoke directly to contemporary spiritual seekers who valued individual experience over institutional mediation. This convergence of ancient text and modern concerns created a cultural phenomenon that transcended academic scholarship. Millions of people who had never heard of Gnostic Christianity suddenly encountered an alternative version of their faith's foundational narrative. Television documentaries, best-selling books, and internet discussions brought this obscure ancient manuscript to global attention within months of its publication. The popular response revealed how hungry contemporary audiences were for alternatives to conventional religious narratives. The Gospel of Judas provided what many seekers had been looking for: historical evidence that the Christianity they knew was just one version among many possible alternatives, and not necessarily the most authentic or appealing version at that. This popular enthusiasm also created new challenges for religious educators and leaders who found themselves defending positions that seemed increasingly arbitrary to modern sensibilities. Why should ancient texts be privileged over contemporary revelations? Why should individual spiritual experience be subordinated to institutional authority? Why should complex moral questions be reduced to simple categories of good and evil? The Vatican's measured response to these challenges demonstrated both the evolution and the limitations of ecclesiastical strategy in the information age. Church officials could no longer simply condemn alternative perspectives and expect them to disappear. They had to engage with scholarly arguments, address specific claims, and compete in the marketplace of ideas rather than relying on institutional authority alone. This transformation represented one of the most significant shifts in the history of religious authority. Where previous generations of church leaders could silence alternative voices through political pressure or social ostracism, modern religious institutions had to rely primarily on persuasion, scholarly argument, and appeals to tradition. The shift from coercion to persuasion reflected broader changes in how Western societies approached questions of truth and authority. The Gospel of Judas refuses to remain buried. After 17 centuries of silence, this forbidden text has emerged to challenge everything we thought we knew about betrayal, faith, and the very foundations of Christianity itself. What started as a chance discovery by Egyptian farmers has become one of the most controversial archaeological finds in modern history, forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions about religious authority and suppressed truth. Whether you see this ancient manuscript as dangerous heresy or authentic revelation, one thing remains undeniable. Some voices, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to speak.